Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a really major shift in global commerce, the recent U.S. tariffs, and this growing feeling that we might be, entering a new phase of trade wars.
Right.
You've been following the news closely on this, and, well, our goal here is to kind of cut through the headlines, understand what these tariffs actually mean on the ground,
Hmm.
and explore the potential ripple effects for all of us, really.
Yeah, absolutely. We're looking at a bunch of news reports, mainly covering the initial U.S. announcement and the immediate reactions from various countries, plus insights from economic experts.
Our goal, really, is to synthesize all of this information for you, to pull out the most critical insights so you have a clear grasp of what's happening, who will feel the impact, and crucially, why it all matters in the bigger picture. We want to give you the knowledge you need without getting, well, lost in excessive detail.
Okay, so let's get straight to it. April 2nd was the day this really kicked off, and President Trump's announcement certainly grabbed attention. He spoke of this new trade policy as achieving economic independence and even called it Liberation Day. That's quite a statement.
It is a very assertive framing, isn't it? The core of this new policy is the introduction of a baseline 10% tariff on almost all goods being imported into the United States, and this is being implemented very swiftly effective April 5th.
Wow, that's quick.
It is. But as you hinted, that's not the whole story.
No, because alongside that, we're seeing these reciprocal tariffs aimed at specific countries, and these kick in just a few days later, April 9th. And what stands out is that these aren't just marginally higher. In some cases, they're significantly more substantial than that initial 10%.
Precisely. The rationale put forward by the U.S. administration centers on what they describe as, well, unfair trading practices by other nations, a lack of genuine reciprocity in trade agreements, and this persistent issue of large trade deficits. They argued these measures are necessary to level the playing field.
And that White House document really lays out that argument in detail, doesn't it? It emphasizes how these trade deficits have allegedly weakened American manufacturing, exposed vulnerabilities in global supply chains, and even raises concerns about national security.
hmm The core argument seems to be that a lack of equivalent tariffs and other barriers in other countries puts U.S. companies at a disadvantage.
What's your take on that framing of reciprocity? I mean, the idea itself isn't new, but the application seems aggressive.
Well, what's interesting, or perhaps notable, is the U.S. assertion that their trade policy historically aimed for balanced tariff reductions. They contend that this balance has shifted over time, leading to the current situation where they feel compelled to act unilaterally to restore it.
Mm.
However, the global trade landscape has evolved considerably, making direct historical comparisons somewhat complex. Different countries have different economic structures, different tax systems like VAT.
Right, which we'll get to. So let's break down who's facing these more significant reciprocal tariffs as of today, April 3rd. China is definitely a key focus, and it sounds like they're facing a really substantial increase.
They are indeed. China is looking at a further 34% tariff on top of the existing 20% levy that was already in
So
place.
that's 54% total.
That brings the total tariff on many Chinese goods up to a considerable 54%. Unsurprisingly, Beijing has already indicated that they will be taking retaliatory measures.
Which could escalate quickly into a tit-for-tat situation.
Exactly, that's the major worry.
And what about the European Union? As a major economic bloc and trading partner with the U.S., they must be significantly affected.
The European Union is facing a broad 20% tariff. We've already heard strong reactions from key EU figures like Ursula von der Leyen, who has stated that the EU will be considering its own countermeasures in response.
So the potential for a trade dispute across the Atlantic is certainly growing.
Definitely.
The UK's situation is particularly interesting given Brexit. How are they positioned in all of this? Are they lumped in with the EU or separate?
They're separate in this case. The United Kingdom will be subject to a 10% tariff, so that baseline rate. However, there's a particularly nuanced issue concerning Northern Ireland.
Ah, the protocol. Or the Windsor Framework now.
Exactly. Due to those post-Brexit arrangements, the differing tariff rates between Northern Ireland at 10% and the Republic of Ireland, part of the EU, so facing 20%, could create complex trade dynamics across the border.
Yeah, that sounds messy.
It could be. Additionally, there's specific worry for significant UK export industries like Scotch whiskey, given the U.S. is a major market for them. That 10% could still hurt specific sectors.
Okay. Now, it's not just these major economic players that are affected, is it? I saw some surprisingly high tariff rates being applied to developing economies in Asia. Why is that?
That's a crucial point to understand, and it's quite concerning. Developing nations such as Cambodia face a very high 49% tariff, Laos 48%, Vietnam 46%, and Myanmar 44%.
Wow, nearly 50% in some cases.
Yes, and experts like Dr. Siwaj Dharmanagara suggest that while these tariffs directly impact these nations, and significantly so, a significant underlying aim might be to disrupt Chinese investment in these regions.
So, making it less attractive for China to use these countries as manufacturing hubs for exports to the U.S.
That seems to be the thinking. The idea is that by making goods from these countries more expensive in the U.S. market, it could indirectly impact China's export strategy and its economy, even though these investments are often vital for the economic development of these Southeast Asian countries themselves.
A potentially significant indirect impact on China, but at a high cost to these developing economies. What about other parts of the globe? Are we seeing a consistent pattern?
It's a fairly wide spectrum, really. Indonesia faces a 32% tariff, Thailand 36%. Even countries with historically close ties to the U.S., like Australia, are facing a 10% tariff.
Which their prime minister publicly criticized, I saw.
Yes, quite strongly. Japan is looking at a 24% tariff.
Hmm?
Canada and Mexico are largely exempt under the USMCA agreement, but it's worth remembering that they have been subject to U.S. tariffs in the past, particularly on steel and aluminum.
Right. Those are still lingering issues.
They are. And several African nations are also heavily affected, with Lesotho, for instance, facing a staggering 50% tariff. The scope of these tariffs is quite broad.
Okay, one sector that seems to have been spared these new tariffs, at least for now, but is causing concern in some countries like Ireland, is pharmaceuticals. Why is that significant?
That's right. Pharmaceuticals are currently not included in these new tariff measures announced on April 2nd. However, Ireland has a very significant presence of U.S. pharmaceutical companies operating there. It's a huge part of their economy.
A massive part.
And the Irish government, through Tennessee Simon Harris, has indicated that they anticipate potential future measures targeting this sector. President Trump has previously expressed a desire to see pharmaceutical manufacturing return to the U.S., suggesting that tariffs could be a tool they might consider down the line. So there's apprehension there.
Right, a kind of not yet, but maybe soon feeling. Okay, so with all these tariffs coming into effect, some almost immediately, others next week, what are the immediate economic consequences that experts are predicting? What are the biggest concerns being voiced? Inflation seems to be right at the top of that list.
Absolutely. There's a widespread worry, almost universal among economists looking at this, that these tariffs will directly translate into higher prices for consumers. Financial analyst Nigel Green stated it pretty bluntly. These tariffs will likely push prices higher on thousands of everyday goods.
And you gave an example earlier, T-shirt.
Yeah, just as a simple illustration. A $20 T-shirt, perhaps made in Vietnam or Cambodia, could potentially cost close to $30 by the time it reaches the U.S. consumer, factoring in those high tariffs. Kymie Archibald, Northern Ireland's economy minister, also emphasized that a trade war scenario would only fuel inflation, further squeezing household budgets that are already under pressure.
And the big overarching fear seems to be that these initial tariffs could trigger a full-blown global trade war. How likely do you think that is based on the reactions so far?
Well, that's the central concern, isn't it? The fear is that the retaliatory measures we're already hearing about from China and the EU could escalate. The U.S. hits us, we hit them back, they hit us back harder. It becomes a cycle of increasing tariffs and trade barriers.
A classic tit-for-tat escalation.
Precisely. And that kind of scenario ultimately harms global trade, disrupts complex supply chains that have taken decades to build, and negatively impacts economic growth worldwide. It's a negative-sum game in the long run.
And former U.S. trade negotiator Stephen Olson made an interesting point about Southeast Asia.
Yes. He pointed out that these high tariffs on Southeast Asian nations could actually backfire on the U.S., potentially pushing those countries to strengthen their economic ties with China as a result, seeking alternative markets and investment.
Interesting unintended consequence there. We're already seeing specific industries starting to feel the impact, aren't we? I saw reports about the sportswear sector, Nike, Adidas.
Yes. Shares in major sportswear companies like Nike, Adidas, and Puma experience a notable drop almost immediately. These companies rely heavily on manufacturing in Asian hubs like Vietnam, Indonesia, Cambodia, precisely the countries facing these high tariffs.
So investors are worried about their costs going up.
Exactly. Investors are clearly concerned about the potential rise in their production costs and the impact on their competitive pricing in the crucial U.S. market.
And the automotive industry in the UK is also raising alarms about potential job losses. What's the situation there? Is that related to the 10% tariff or something else?
It's slightly more complex. There's the general 10% tariff, but also a new 25% tariff specifically on car imports that apparently came into effect today, April 3rd, according to some reports. Plus, there are anticipated tariffs on imported car parts.
Ah,
This combination is a significant worry for the UK automotive supply chain. Industry representatives like Matt Harwood have warned that this could put tens of thousands of jobs at risk. The UK car industry has already faced considerable headwinds post-Brexit, and with the shift to EVs, and these new tariffs could further depress production and demand.
right. Agriculture is another sector that seems particularly vulnerable, especially if China decides to retaliate against U.S. agricultural exports. How significant could that impact be for American farmers?
It could be very significant. China's a huge market for U.S. agricultural products, soybeans, pork, etc. Any retaliatory tariffs imposed by Beijing could severely impact American farmers' bottom lines.
And what about Australia? They got the 10% tariff, but you mentioned beef exports.
Yeah, it's an interesting, slightly unusual situation for Australia's beef exports to the U.S. right now. Because of recent drought conditions in the U.S., American cattle numbers are currently unusually low.
Okay, so they need to import more beef.
Exactly, their reliance on imports is higher than normal. So while the 10% tariff is definitely a negative for Australian beef producers, some analysts suggest that American consumers might end up bearing a larger portion of that added cost in the short term, simply due to this specific supply dynamic. Doesn't make the Aussies happy, but the impact might be shared differently than in other sectors.
Interesting nuance, and it sounds like the drinks industry, particularly Irish whiskey producers, are bracing for a potentially major setback. That 20% EU tariff hits them directly.
Absolutely. The Irish Whiskey Association has voiced serious concerns, predicting devastating impacts. The U.S. is a critical, absolutely vital export market for Irish whiskey, accounting for a substantial portion of their annual sales.
Huge market.
They emphasize that the EU and U.S. spirits sector has really flourished under a tariff-free trading environment, and these new tariffs directly threaten that mutually beneficial relationship. It's not just about whiskey either. It affects bourbon going the other way, potentially.
Right. We're also seeing immediate reactions in the global financial markets, aren't we? What kind of signals are the markets sending? Panic, concern.
I'd say significant concern and uncertainty. Immediately following the announcement, global stock markets generally experienced a downturn. The U.S. dollar weakened against other major currencies.
And investors ran for cover.
Well, they began moving towards what are traditionally considered safer investments, things like government bonds and gold. This risk-off type of market response really underscores the level of apprehension surrounding these trade developments and the potential for further instability.
Okay. And we shouldn't forget the potential consequences for those developing nations in Asia that we discussed earlier, the ones facing those really high tariffs.
Yep.
What's the broader concern there beyond just the economics?
Well, the high tariffs being imposed on countries like Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and Myanmar could have particularly severe negative consequences for their already vulnerable economies. We're talking about threatening crucial jobs, export revenues. It could genuinely hinder their overall development and potentially impact social and political stability in those regions.
Right. The ripple effects go beyond just trade figures. Okay, turning our attention to the political and diplomatic fallout, it sounds like the reaction from governments around the world has been largely one of, well, condemnation.
That's accurate. We've seen strong statements of disapproval from governments in Australia, Ireland, across the European Union. Promises of retaliatory measures and countermeasures are being made, as we noted, by China and the EU.
But also calls for talks.
Yes, alongside the threats, there are also calls for immediate negotiation and de-escalation from leaders such as Ireland's Tanis Tamsin-Harris and Minister Pascal Donohoe. They're trying to find an off-ramp. The EU is even actively discussing potential responses, maybe dusting off plans related to those previous U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum.
And the UK.
The UK, while acknowledging the situation and the potential harm, has stated its intention to respond with cool and calm heads, trying not to escalate immediately, perhaps.
There are also some interesting details and nuances emerging, aren't there? For example, the way the U.S. administration is justifying these as reciprocal rates. You mentioned VAT earlier.
Yes, this is quite notable and controversial. The U.S. administration is asserting that these tariffs are reciprocal by apparently factoring in value-added tax, VAT, and other indirect taxes that exist in other countries when comparing them to U.S. import duties.
Which the U.S. doesn't have at a federal level.
Correct. The U.S. has state sales taxes, but not a federal VAT like the EU or UK. However, this methodology is being questioned quite strongly by the EU. Peter Burke, an Irish minister, specifically raised concerns and asked for clarity on the data President Trump is using.
And he pointed out an inconsistency.
Yes. Burke pointed out that the UK also has VAT, yet it's facing a lower 10% tariff rate compared to the EU's 20%. This suggests to him, at least, an inconsistency in the application of this reciprocal logic. Or perhaps other factors are at play. Bertie Ahern, the former Irish Taoiseach, also publicly expressed skepticism about the accuracy of Trump's calculations.
Okay. And there's also a change coming regarding the de minimis loophole for low-value packages, particularly those originating from China. How will that affect things for, say, online shoppers?
Yes, the de minimis rule, which currently allows low-value packages typically under $800 to enter the U.S. without incurring duties or taxes, is being closed specifically for goods shipped from China.
Yeah.
This takes effect May 2nd.
So those cheap gadgets or clothes ordered online from China?
Exactly. This change could have a significant impact on consumers who frequently purchase lower-cost goods directly from Chinese online retailers like Shein or Temu, as those purchases will likely become subject to tariffs, making them more expensive.
Right, that could be quite noticeable for some people. The situation in Northern Ireland really stands out as a unique challenge, given the complexities of the post-Brexit arrangements. What's the core issue there, again, with the differing tariffs?
Absolutely. The fact that Northern Ireland, under the Windsor framework, effectively stays aligned with some EU rules for goods, but is part of the UK's tariff regime, means it faces the UK's 10% tariff on US imports. But the Republic of Ireland, just across the border and an EU member, faces the EU's 20% tariffs.
So goods entering the Republic are taxed higher than those entering the North.
Potentially, yes, for U.S. imports. This difference has the potential to create trade distortions, maybe incentives for goods to be routed through Northern Ireland to avoid the higher EU tariff, and generally creates issues along that already sensitive border. It could inadvertently reignite some of the complexities that the Windsor framework was designed to smooth over.
Yeah, definitely one to watch. Finally, this concept of economic independence that the U.S. administration is emphasizing, is there a potential downside to pursuing that through such broad tariffs? Could it backfire?
There certainly is a potential downside. While the desire for greater economic independence, or perhaps resilience, is understandable for any nation, especially after the supply chain shocks of recent years,
Sure.
there's a significant question of whether these broad tariff policies could inadvertently lead to economic isolation in our deeply interconnected global economy. Erecting high tariff barriers could have unintended negative consequences for the U.S. itself.
Such as?
Well, potentially harming their own export markets as other countries inevitably retaliate,
Yeah.
and definitely increasing costs for American businesses that rely on imported components and materials for their own production processes. It's really simple.
Okay, so just to quickly recap where we are today, April 3rd. The U.S. has announced and begun implementing significant new tariffs on a wide range of imported goods. This has sparked widespread concern about potential economic damage, inflation, disruption, and a real risk of a global trade war.
Right. We're seeing a chorus of negative reactions from governments and industries worldwide, with major players like China and the EU already vowing to take countermeasures.
And it's really crucial for everyone listening to understand that this situation is incredibly fluid. It's evolving very rapidly, day by day almost.
Absolutely. The long-term consequences of these tariffs are still highly uncertain. We will likely see further significant developments, retaliations, negotiations, maybe shifts in policy in the weeks and months ahead as the global response takes shape.
So as you're processing all of this, here's a key question to really consider. In a world that is so interconnected, what is the actual balance between a nation's pursuit of economic independence or security and the realities of our global economic system? What do you think the potential unintended consequences of this significant shift in trade policy could be? Not just for multinational corporations and political leaders, but, for your everyday life as a consumer, for small businesses in your community, and for the broader landscape of international relations. How might these developments ultimately affect you personally? It's definitely something to think deeply about.
Indeed it is. And to ensure you stay informed as these complex global issues continue to unfold, because they will continue to unfold and impact all of us. Please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have hit that bell icon.
Yeah, that little bell is important.
It really is. Your support is what allows us to keep doing these deep dives, to bring you this kind of in-depth analysis and help you navigate an increasingly complex world.
Absolutely. By subscribing and hitting the bell, you'll be notified immediately when we release new deep dives into important topics like this, helping you stay ahead of the curve. Thank you so much for joining us for this crucial discussion today.